Thank you very much indeed. I suppose I'm 20 minutes to look at Northern Ireland post-partition, and Henry has touched on some things I would hope to develop. But if we go back to the partition of Ireland very briefly, it's important to remember that while James Craig had perceived a homeland for Ulster Protestants in the event of Home Rule way back in the early years of the 20th century when he went into politics, the Northern Nationalists had never considered partition. Reluctantly, though, by 1914, 1916, it was thrust upon them, and even then they hoped it would be temporary. That was the idea, certainly after the Easter Rising, that Ireland would be quickly reunited. And it would have been a very soft border had a limited, devolved administration taken root in Dublin with the British Army and the Viceregal Lodge still governing the whole country, as it were. But it's really after the First World War, following the bolt from the blue, the Easter Rising, the demand for a republic, and President Wilson's emphasis on the freedom of small nations, all of those small nations of the empires which had collapsed, particularly the Poles, the Czechs, the Slovaks. There was much emphasis on the idea of the Irish right to self-determination, no longer home rule, and Sinn Féin were demanding a republic. And it's in the sort of fall of 1919, early 1920, that a committee is set up in London to, if you like, outline the Irish policy of this Tory-dominated coalition government, because the Conservatives, the traditional friends of Ulster Unionism, led by Bonar Law, had the whip hand in the government that redrew the map of Europe with the American president, and of course, finally turned to the Irish question. And this sort of punch cartoon suggests correctly that by the end of 1919, the Long Committee, as it was known, at Westminster was considering a 9-county Northern Ireland, that the island would be divided on 9 county lines with separate parliaments north and south. And this would have been the outlines, except James Craig intervened in 1919. He said that 9 counties would be ungovernable and that Protestant representation, quote unquote, would be strengthened in a 6-county area. This was the homeland he thought about way back, about 1905, 1906, when he entered politics. The significant thing is, of course, that the Northern Nationalists, led by Joe Devlin at Westminster, though Sinn Féin abstained, they were not consulted at all about the partition scheme. Devlin argued for safeguards, a protective Senate for the Northern Nationalists, which is something the Southern Unionists were given under the 1920 Act, and which was actually reintroduced in the treaty. The Senate in the Irish Free State had 50% of the seats for former Unionists and Protestants. That didn't happen in the North. Devlin said this was the worst form of partition, and of course permanent partition. And of course, as the state is set up, it's set up against a background of violence. Obviously, the War of Independence had affected the whole of Ireland. This saw, of course, the introduction of the Ulster Special Constabulary, 32,000 strong by 1922. Without them, a border from Lough to Carlingford Lough could not have been drawn through hostile nationalist areas with an IRA campaign underway. The Nationalists had been divided from 1916 between Sinn Féin, led by De Valera and Griffith and Collins, and of course Joe Devlin, who had been the coming man in the Home Rule movement back in 1912-14. He was regarded as the perhaps second Prime Minister of a Home Rule Ireland, having galvanised the nationalist vote in the North, his finger very much on the Hibernian Pulse, which was a big organisation, sectarian organisation, to match the Orange Order on the Catholic side at that time. Devlin's election manifesto simply read, "Partition means national suicide." The two nationalist parties boycotted elections for the Northern Ireland Parliament in 1921, and the King's speech on that day was directed at Sinn Féin in the South, unlocking the conflict and opening the doors to negotiations in London. The Nationalists boycotted it, hoping that somehow Sinn Féin would, if you like, magic a united Ireland, or at least a federal Ireland, out of the surrounding chaos. That didn't actually happen. The best that Sinn Féin got in the end was the continued existence of Northern Ireland and a boundary commission, which would redraw the border according to the wishes of the inhabitants, but also subject to economic and geographic conditions. It's incredible that Collins didn't ask for a plebiscite, as it was being implemented all over Europe, and that really fatally flawed the Boundary Commission. Violence continued in Northern Ireland until 1922. The killing fields of North Belfast, nearly 500 died, nearly 60% of them Catholics. And of course you had mass population movements from south to north, but particularly from north to south. Something like 20 to 50,000 Northern nationalists left the area for the Free State against the background of the conflict and the kind of exodus of those years. And Collins, in the middle there, who signed the treaty with Griffith, Collins, of course, presided over a very, very bitter Northern Ireland state in 1922 as the South plummeted towards civil war. You have the famous McMahon family murders in North Belfast. There were sectarian atrocities committed by the IRA as well. And Collins had a twin-track policy. On the one hand, he was promoting negotiations with Craig, the Craig-Collins Pacts of 1922, which promised much, including policing reform, but failed to deliver and were washed away in a river of blood. On the other hand, of course, he was covertly supporting the Northern IRA, and particularly the 3rd Northern Division in Belfast, really right down to the Irish Civil War. His pact, Craig in Dublin in 1922, following the first Craig-Collins Pact, Churchill very much brokering these as colonial secretary in charge of Irish affairs. But of course, Collins's death changes everything. The Free State government quickly abandoned Collins's covert support for physical force nationalism in the north. He had also paid the salaries of Catholic teachers as a gesture against partition. And very much as the South becomes embroiled in an increasingly bitter civil war, as Henry has said, the Northern nationalists are very much forgotten in this equation. And the Unionist state began to consolidate over the 6 counties. And that, of course, introduced all the issues that would haunt the 1960s. As Unionism consolidated, you had the abolition of PR, which had been introduced as a minority safeguard north and south, first for local elections in 1922, in places like Fermanagh and the city of Derry, Londonderry, both of which had nationalist majorities, particularly Derry, which had briefly a nationalist corporation at the time of partition, arguing for inclusion in the Irish Free State. Of course, this required gerrymandering. We have one Fermanagh Unionist saying, "I've been gerrymandering by night," in 1922. And that became the name of the game in huge swathes of territory west of the Bann in particular. And that would harden, of course, after the Second World War in particular. The British actually briefly refused to give the Local Government Act of 1922 the royal assent. It abolished PR, but eventually they resiled because they were facing a unionist uprising led by Craig at that time. And of course, these early years, which were the years of massive nationalist abstentionism, saw the consolidation of the state, the laying of the foundations. The Londonderry Education Act, for example, a bid to introduce non-sectarian schools, was also, of course, the act that allowed the Catholic Church to opt out of the system. It meant Catholic schools got no funding at all in the 1920s, apart from teacher salaries, whereas on the Protestant side, they handed over their schools, but insisted by 1925 on Bible teaching and the right to appoint Protestant teachers. And as one historian has put it, from the 1920s on, you had the endowment of Protestantism by the state in Northern Ireland. The Catholics got 50% funding in 1930. It went up to 65 and into the 80s after O'Neill came to power in the 60s. But they were always sort of on the back foot. You also had, of course, the Special Powers Act. It was a vital piece of legislation introduced at the peak, really, of the sectarian violence of those years. Introduced in 22, it gave draconian powers to the police and military authorities in the north. They could arrest people really on a whimsy. It was the basis for internment from the 20s until 1971. Exclusion orders could be served on Republicans from the south, on trade unionists like Thomas Mann, for example, when he tried to enter Northern Ireland in the 30s. And that became a permanent part of the state apparatus in 1933. I just read recently where a constitutional lawyer in Henry's University, UU, Fiona Nielloin, argued that the, if you like, continuity of a draconian Special Powers Act at the heart of government in Northern Ireland actually undermined the concept of the state as a liberal democracy at that time. And of course, during this period, as one historian put it, in every area where the regional parliament, which became Stormont in 1932, exercised real control, education, representation, law and order, quote, policy was determined by the majority with scant regard for the interests and susceptibilities of the minority. Sorry, I didn't mean to bring Hitler in quite so early. Even though he met Lord Londonderry and they got on well. James Craig, of course, in his 50s became Prime Minister, and he was a man with his finger very much on the Unionist pulse, the backroom boy of the Covenant, of the Ulster Volunteers, and of course presiding over the formation of the Ulster Specials, a sectarian force which survived after 1925 to 1970 really, as the B Specials in these years. By 1929, Craig declared that he wanted two parties in the Northern Ireland Parliament, men who were for the Union on the one hand and men who were against it and for a Dublin Parliament on the other. And this was the basis for the total abolition of PR, the last minority safeguard. After that, elections became boring and predictable. You had a frozen political system. No unionists contested South Armagh, no nationalists contested North Antrim. And very few seats were actually contested, down to the famous snowman election, O'Neill's last gambit in 1969. Craig had engaged with nationalism in 22 when he signed those pacts, but he eventually moved away from it. And of course, by the 1930s, nationalism had become a state within a state, with its own social, cultural, educational infrastructure. The GAA, Gaelic Games, the Irish News, even a Catholic hospital, which would be excluded from the state service, very controversially, after the Second World War, the Mater Infermorum Hospital. So Stormont, established in 1932, was very much a symbol of the permanency, really, of unionism. And yet the state was polarised between a two-thirds unionist majority and a one-third nationalist majority. Labour never really made the breakthrough it should have done on the basis of the vast numbers of unionised labour in the shipyards and elsewhere, and only ever won a handful of seats, with a surge in the late 50s, early 60s, facing unemployment and, it seemed, a period of political lessening of tension at that particular time. The nationalists, of course, didn't take their seats officially until 1927, when they formed a party of really 10 in the House of Commons at Stormont, led by Joe Devlin. He criticised the Special Powers Act, the discriminatory legislation, but he was getting nowhere with James Craig. He also hoped to open up lines of connection to liberal unionism, to Labour, to produce a kind of a popular front. But he was frustrated by his failure and the lack of real financial powers at Stormont. This is Joe Devlin, who died in 1934, a popular and a populist figure who had done a lot for the mill workers of Belfast. It was said on the day of his funeral in January 1934, Ireland was united for one day, with Tommy Henderson, a Shankill Road loyalist and independent unionist, shouldering Joe Devlin's coffin past Northumberland Street, where Tommy Henderson told a BBC reporter in the 60s, he's once thrown stones at Joe Devlin's triumphal procession. But of course, the RUC had been formed in 22. One-third of the place is reserved for Catholics. In the early stages, Catholics formed perhaps 17% all ranks, the hangover from the old All-Ireland, mainly Catholic, Royal Irish Constabulary. But by the Troubles, it had fallen to 10%. Of course, the Ulster Specials survive as the B Specials from the early years of the state onwards. The Boundary Commission collapsed in 1925, having suggested only minor changes, which embarrassed the Free State government, and the resulting tripartite agreement confirmed partition and left the Northern Nationalists feeling very much abandoned. Cahir Healy, the border nationalist leader, former Sinn Féiner, who was on Michael Collins' committees in 22, talked about the complete abandonment of Northern nationalism by the Free State government of William Cosgrave. And so you have a shift towards De Valera and the emerging Fianna Fáil party of that period. You can see the minor changes in South Armagh, with a large part of East Donegal, a unionist area, a Protestant area from the plantation, due to be transferred to Northern Ireland. something which of course had never been contemplated by Collins. There's the minor changes that would have happened. Craig would have accepted them, but the Free State shot them down. And we move on, of course. The Northern Nationalists were they were a coalition of the old Sinn Féiners from west of the Bann, like Cahir Healy, and the Home Rule Nationalists, the Hibernians, who had supported John Redmond a decade or so earlier. And of course, the influence of Orangism in this government is quite significant. Even John Lavery, a Catholic from just across the road, actually, but of North Armagh parentage, famously painted the 12th in Portadown at the height of Orangism in the 1930s. Virtually every Unionist MP, cabinet minister and prime minister down to 1971 was a member of the Orange Order. Terence O'Neill made a big mistake when he entered Northern Ireland politics in 1945 and acquired Glebe House, a hall outside Ballymena, because in his first month of July there, he heard these lambeg drums in his garden, and he didn't realise the previous incumbent had encouraged the local lodge to celebrate there. He drove them off, "Get off my land!" And then he suddenly realised, as he had political inclinations, he would have to join the Orange Order. So he had to join a lodge away up the road to cover his embarrassment. O'Neill, of course, an English liberal rather than an Ulster Unionist, although he had feet in both camps. De Valera, of course, is very much the focus for nationalist hopes in the 30s. But in the famous 1938 negotiations, when he got back the ports and ended the economic war, he failed really to get any success on partition. Although the Dominion's office under Malcolm MacDonald was keen to go into the whole issue of the treatment of Catholics in Northern Ireland. But they found that the Home Office down to 1972 dealt with Stormont. And the Home Office was very protective of Stormont. One of its officials wrote in 1938, during these negotiations, these Anglo-Irish negotiations, it was inevitable and understandable that Northern Ireland would be a Protestant state. That was the view at the time. Of course, we've talked about De Valera's Catholic Ireland there. We've heard Henry on that. Cardinal McCrory, of course, a very firm anti-partitionist during this period. And indeed, the Catholics in general were totally opposed to the state. They never accommodated themselves to the Northern Ireland state at all. It's not until the late 50s, early 60s that a change comes about. The conscription crisis in the late 30s had the same effect as the 1918 conscription crisis in mobilising Catholic support and all-Ireland support led by De Valera against the Northern Ireland government. Of course, the war years see a lessening of tension and all of that, but it's in the post-war years that the great changes occur that are significant for the emergence of civil rights in the future. This is the 20-year premiership of Basil Brooke, a man who said he ceased to call himself an Irishman the moment he heard of the Eastern Rising in the trenches of the Western Front. It was actually on a visit to Dublin in 1919 that he actually had the idea of Protestant vigilantes to protect isolated border communities from the IRA, and this morphed into the Ulster Special Constabulary. I think we can see Brookbur's unchanging view of the Catholic population, reaching about 35% by the 1950s. In his advice to a cabinet minister in 1942, he heard that Catholics were being employed in Derry in the deep sea docks on Royal Naval contracts, largely because of the American presence in Northern Ireland. And he said, "These people are a fifth column in our midst. If I was a German general, I would use them." He never really deviated from that view of the Catholic nationalist population in these years. And of course, the 30s were marked by sectarian rhetoric and sectarian violence, tensions over the Royal Jubilee, the rise of the Ulster Protestant League, a renewed IRA in the 30s, saw the Belfast riots, in which 11 people died, several hundred houses burnt down in the city of Belfast, and of course British troops deployed for the first time since the 20s. Interesting then, of course, that the British government failed to intervene in 1935, despite the approaches of the Catholic Church and the Nationalist Party. As a later British Home Secretary from the Labour tradition, and I know Russell will be saying something about this, Tutor Eade said in 1949, Northern Ireland affairs are no business of ours. That seemed to be the steady view, despite the fact that under the Government of Ireland Act, Section 75, Westminster was and asserted itself to be the supreme authority over every person and thing in Northern Ireland. Still, the Speaker's Convention, adopted in 1922, meant that it was very difficult to raise issues of local government, law and order, special powers on the floor of Westminster. It wasn't until the election of Gerry Fitt and the British Labour Group, the Campaign for Democracy in Ulster in the 60s, that taboo was finally broken. The anti-partition campaign after the war was very much a distraction. It was never going to achieve anything, particularly in light of Southern Irish neutrality during the war. The North had protected the sea lanes and was now about to receive the unbounded, if you like, gratitude of the British people, and in particular the Labour government, which would copper-fasten partition in the 1949 Ireland Act. So you have the anti-partition campaign based on the hopes that Labour might intervene. Lord Longford was a nationalist voice, I suppose, as a British Labour minister. But of course, the welfare state was coming in. This is a period of massive change in Britain and unexpectedly in Northern Ireland. This region moved from the poverty of the 1930s, the hungry 30s, to a land of free specs and false teeth by the 1940s and 50s. The only thing I didn't like, and I'm a 50s child, was the cod liver oil that was poured down our throats. Happily, some people on the Falls Road were found giving it to greyhounds, and they withdrew it. That was my happiest hour, I think, age 4. But there you are. Dominion status. The Unionists feared creeping socialism. They always did. The Labour government would somehow interfere, and they had a track record in the past of supporting Irish nationalism. But of course, this led to a crisis in the Stormont regime, the Dominion status crisis of 1945. Some minister, notably a man called W.F. McCoy from County Tyrone, a minister, wanted to declare a Dominion with a Union Jack in the corner of the Ulster flag. But Brookby realised that this would shatter the Unionist monolith of working and middle class and skilled labour support. And so in the end, the British promised subventions to support the welfare state here. And you have massive changes. I mean, the post-war years, 45 to 51, witness a veritable revolution in Northern Ireland, with the arrival of the welfare state, the abolition of the Poor Law, the old Union workhouse and the Lisburn Road disappears forever, and of course, free universal education, from nursery school to university, which enables working class children to aspire to a degree and a profession. This is a real game changer. It doesn't happen south of the border until 1967, but it happens here in the late 40s. It probably has a disproportionate effect on the Catholic minority, with all the religious orders, St Malachy's College, Belfast, the Mercy Nuns, the Dominicans who educated Mary McAleese. They went full throttle to take advantage of free education, very silently. As a former archivist in St Malachy's College, and I remember going through the rolls, and you suddenly have this massive upsurge in day boys from the New Lodge and Ardoyne. In 1948, 1949, you can see no longer the sons of the middle classes and the big farmers in Antrim and Down. You have this new element coming in, going to Queen's, getting degrees. And of course, this is the 11-plus generation, which will become one of the game changers in the civil rights movement. By the late 50s, people like John Hume and Austin Curry and Eamon McCann are producing, early 60s certainly, are producing a critique of nationalism as well as unionism. The old rural-based nationalist party, who drifted in and out of Stormont, but they're after the war, then they're gone again, had no coherent policy, were rural-based, were deeply conservative. One newspaper chain in west of the Bann accounted for about 6 of the 12 nationalist representatives at Stormont. Editors, reporters, managers, Paddy McGill, Roddy O'Connor, they were all associated with the Ulster Herald group of newspapers. As Richard Rose said, they were an association of local notables. Like bishops, they answered to no one, they were answering to no one. But the 50s, of course, were a lost decade. If I could just say that briefly, there were opportunities in the 50s. For the first time in anti-partition literature and anti-partition archives, you see the Cross-McGlen branch of the Anti-Partition League in 1950 expressing concern at the growing tacit support among South Armagh nationalists for the welfare state, saying this is creating a problem and will create a problem in the future. This is something the nationalists didn't have to worry about in the 30s and the 40s. There is that there. But of course, Brookborough doesn't respond to this. Despite the fact there were liberal influences, you had Brian McGuinness, a Lisburn solicitor, who banned provocative marches along the Longstone Road, and so on. The Brookborough response included the Flags and Emblems Act of 1954, the Mater Hospital issue, an acute teaching hospital not funded by the state, or even supported by the hiring of beds, as it would have been in England, but was supported by a football pool for 25 years. It was a standing affront in the nationalist community in this period. In 1956, the Unionist government tried to change the regulations on family allowance. Ivan Neil was the minister. Brookborough went along with it. The idea is there would be no family allowance after the third child. This was to target, they said, politically disloyal elements, and to their great credit, it was the Presbyterian Church who reared up at their assembly that summer and saying that this was targeted at the poorest section of the population. So this was the 50s. The IRA border campaign, of course, grew out of the failures of the Anti-Partition League, its high expectations not matched, and the constant problem of unemployment and emigration in the south. It was localised, it was short, 11 people died, but as the IRA acknowledged when they called it off in 1952, it failed to ignite support from the Catholic population. Changes were occurring in nationalism, the 47 Act, and the rise of this new educated Catholic class, not yet perhaps a middle class, products of the 47 Act. And of course, labour was reviving in Belfast with the closure of factories in 1959-62, that period. Lemass had come to power in the south. Eddie McAteer recorded that when the nationalists went to Dublin, they got tea, sympathy and little else. It was Lemass who told the nationalists to engage with Brookborough on the issue of the Mater Hospital. Mind you, they wouldn't have got very much mileage because Brookborough had rejected the recommendations of the H.G. Tanner report of 1955, when an English hospital administrator argued for a kind of a sort of a relationship between the Mater and the state, whereby the Mater would hire so many beds and subvent a hospital where doctors were paid less than in the National Health Service. Brookborough had ignored that. Nonetheless, Lemass also urged Eddie McAteer in 1965 to accept the role of official opposition at Stormont. O'Neill comes to power in these years, and of course, he offers, it seems, a more inclusive society, beckoning Catholics to accept their place in his modern vision of Northern Ireland. But he wasn't prepared to risk divisions in his own party, as decisions in the 60s, the naming of the new city, Craigavon, the closure of the Omagh to Derry railway line on the Bennett Report, 1963, and of course the siting of the new university, not in Derry with its educational tradition going back to Columgill and the presence of McGee, but of course in the Unionist market town of Coleraine. Investment seemed to be focused in the east, not in the west, and all the while there was the fact that unionism had derogated from the new Westminster norm introduced by Labour in 1945 of one man, one vote. Here, the Election and Franchise Act of 1946 denied the entire population, Falls and Shankill, working class people, of one man, one vote if they didn't pay rates or part of their rent. And this was, as Henry dug out of the Ulster Unionist Council archives, because, as Brian Faulkner put it in 1958, this was because of Derry, Fermanagh and Tyrone, quote unquote. It was in these areas, Fermanagh, Tyrone, Dungannon, Londonderry Corporation, that councils discriminated not just in jobs. 3 out of 25 corporation bus drivers in Derry in 1962 from the Catholic community, who were 65% of the population, but also in houses. And the efforts of the Housing Trust, set up as a kind of a centralised agency in 1945 to build houses for all, while very, very fair, it was thwarted by the activities of these councils. The Housing Trust, under Lucius O'Brien, a very, very moderate man, built houses for all, but they only built 47,000 houses. Twice that number were built by the local authorities. And Catholics were at the sharp end of this because they wanted to maintain, as Cameron said in 1969, the political balance. The civil rights movement, of course, was around the corner. These new graduates pressing nationalism, the influence of the black civil rights movement, the advent of Labour under Wilson in 1968, and suddenly you had the campaign by the McCluskeys and Dungannon, highlighting serial discrimination. And the civil rights movement would be formed in 1967. Thank you very much.